The Continental Duke spoke French to insult her. She calmly translated it for the bishop across the room. A true story of Brussels, October 1887. Brussels, October 1887. The kind of night where the chandeliers cost more than the meal, and everyone at the table knows it, and everyone at the table pretends not to. The dining room of the Van Houten residence seated 14 people along a table that could have comfortably accommodated 20. That was intentional. Space between guests meant you were never accidentally close to a boring one. The silverware was French, the wine was Bordeaux. The tablecloth was the particular shade of white that only comes from being laundered by someone whose entire professional life is devoted to the laundering of other people's tablecloths, with the focus and quiet pride of a person who has decided that if they are going to do a thing, they are going to do it completely. You can always tell the difference between a tablecloth that has been ironed and one that has been cared for. This one had been cared for. Mira Voss sat near the middle of the table, in the seat that people like her always occupied, close enough to be useful, far enough not to matter. She was 34 years old. She had been working as a professional interpreter and private translator for 11 years. In that time, she had sat at dozens of tables like this one, tables where the fish arrived in 3 separate sauces, and the men talked about things they did not fully understand, with the total confidence of people who had never once been corrected in their adult lives. Tables where women spoke carefully, weighing each sentence for what it might cost them before releasing it into the room. Tables where she was introduced at the beginning of the evening and then immediately forgotten, which was, she had concluded sometime around age 28, the ideal professional condition. You couldn't listen properly if people were watching you listen. Invisibility was a working state. She had a small card in her lap, and a pen she kept clicking open and shut, very slowly, whenever someone said something worth noting. She was there, on behalf of Madame Geertruide den Haag, the Dutch diplomat's wife, sitting 2 seats to her left. Madame den Haag spoke functional French. She had been speaking it for 30 years, and it had never quite lost the particular flatness that Dutch puts on top of everything. But she preferred not to rely on functional at formal events where the wrong parsing of a sentence could do the work of a small political incident. A word misheard, an implication missed, a joke received as a statement. She had seen all 3 happen to other people, and she had hired Mira specifically to ensure they did not happen to her. That was what Mira was for. The pen clicked. Open. Shut. She had been doing this for so long that she no longer needed to look at the card when she wrote on it. She could write in near darkness, in moving carriages, at the back of opera halls where the acoustics made everyone sound like they were singing from inside a very expensive bucket. She could write 2 words that contained the substance of a paragraph and read them back 6 months later and know exactly what she had meant. She had developed her own shorthand over the years, not a formal system, nothing she had been taught, just the compressions that had accumulated from 11 years of needing to put a lot of information into a very small space very quickly. The card for tonight already had 8 notations on it, and the soup had not yet arrived. Tonight the lighting was exceptional. She barely needed to glance at her hand at all. That left her eyes free to watch the room. She had learned to watch rooms the way certain people learn to listen to music, not casually, not for pleasure, but structurally, following the separate lines of it, tracking what each voice was doing and how the voices related to each other and where the whole composition was heading. She could tell you, within 20 minutes of arriving anywhere, who deferred to whom, and which deference was genuine, and which was performed, and which alliances in the room had real warmth in them, and which were dry maintenance kept alive for practical reasons. She could tell you which conversations were actually about what they appeared to be about, and which were carrying an entirely different freight below the surface, the way rivers carry silt, invisibly, constantly, and with more eventual consequence than the water itself. Most rooms were not complicated, once you learned to look at them correctly. This one was moderately interesting. At her end of the table, a Flemish banker and his wife, who spoke to each other with the practiced shorthand of 2 people 20 years into a marriage, comfortable enough together that they had long stopped performing happiness for each other's benefit, which she found she liked. It was a specific kind of ease that only came from time and had no substitute, a young German attaché who was clearly at his first formal Brussels dinner and was handling his nerves by being meticulous with everything, his posture, his utensils, the timing of his responses. He would learn. The Dutch ambassador himself, a solid and reasonable man in his late 50s, who had chosen Madame Den Haag as a wife, because she was cleverer than him, and he knew it, and had the grace never to make that a problem in their 30 years together. A French botanist who was at the wrong dinner. He was supposed to be somewhere in the 7th arrondissement in Paris, but had gotten the dates confused and was making the best of a situation he had not prepared for, which made him both the most bewildered person in the room and, by some distance, the most genuinely curious about what everyone around him was saying. And at her end, just to her left, Madame Den Haag, who was watching the room with the same economy of expression that Mira used, which was how Mira had known, the very first time they worked together 6 years ago, that they would understand each other without needing to explain much. At the far end of the table sat Bishop Aubert from Liège, who had a broad and honest face, and the particular appetite of a man who had decided that taking genuine pleasure in good food was a form of gratitude, and he was not going to be shy about it. He was 61 years old. He had been a priest for 15 years, and a bishop for 19. He had the look of someone who had spent 4 decades listening to people at their most unguarded, and had come out the other side with his goodwill intact, which was its own kind of achievement. 2 minor government officials whose names Mira had not caught in the introductions. A Belgian countess of some vintage who wore her jewelry the way other women wore their age, plainly, without apology, as information rather than decoration. And the Van Houtens themselves, hosting with the smooth, tireless efficiency of people who had been doing this for decades, and for whom a dinner for 14 was simply a Tuesday with better cheese. And then Duke Heinrich Kratz of Saxony something, sitting in the center of the table, where the light was best, as if the arrangement of the room had been planned around him. It had not been, but he occupied it as if it had. The pen clicked. Open. Shut. She watched him for the first 20 minutes and formed her assessment the way she always did. Not from the words, because words were almost always the last thing that told you about a person, but from the architecture of how he moved through the room, where his eyes went and for how long he held eye contact and with whom, the speed at which his laugh arrived relative to the end of the joke, whether he listened when other people spoke or whether he was simply waiting, with the slightly absent expression of a man conserving his attention for more important things, for his turn. He was not waiting for his turn. He did not experience the dinner as something with turns. He experienced it as a performance, for which he had been given the principal role, and he was delivering it with the ease of a man who had never once had a bad night in his professional life, not because he was incapable of bad nights, but because he had never been in a room that required him to account for one. He had the ease of permanent permission, the ease of a man who had never opened a door and wondered if he was allowed through it. She wrote on her card, in her compressed shorthand, P.F., EXP, not Ed, principal performer, experienced, not accustomed to being edited. She clicked the pen shut. She had spoken to Bishop Aubert during the reception before dinner, while the guests were standing with their aperitifs and performing the necessary first movements of a formal evening, the introductions, the small assessments, the conversational circles that form and dissolve and reform around different people as everyone figures out where the interesting conversations are going to happen and positions themselves accordingly. She had been near the window. She was always near the window at these things, where the light was better and you had a wall at your back and a clear line of sight to most of the room. When the bishop had appeared beside her with his aperitif and looked out at the street below with the mild, rested expression of a man who found other people interesting and did not need to perform this interest. He simply had it. "You are the interpreter, yes," he had said, in French. His French was correct but slow, built sentence by sentence, each one considered before release. "Yes, Your Excellency," she said, "for Madame Den Haag's household." He nodded, looking at the street. A carriage passed below. "A difficult skill," he said, "to find the same meaning in 2 different languages. They are never quite the same shape, are they? The same idea in French and in Dutch sits differently, takes up different room, means slightly different things at the edges. She had been slightly surprised. Most people, when they found out she was an interpreter, said one of three things. They said, "How wonderful, you must know so many languages." Or they said, "It must be very useful, being able to speak with people from different countries." Or they said nothing particularly and moved on toward someone they found more interesting. The bishop had said something that was actually about the work, about what it required and what it involved. He had been thinking about it before he asked. "No," she said, "they're never the same shape. That's what makes it interesting. You are always choosing which part of the original to preserve and which part to let go. You can be faithful to the meaning or faithful to the rhythm, but you can rarely be perfectly faithful to both at once. Every translation is a series of small decisions." "And who decides which decisions are correct?" he asked. "The translator," she said. "That's why it matters who the translator is." He considered this. He turned from the window and looked at her with the clear, steady eyes of someone who was genuinely taking in what had just been said, rather than waiting to respond to it. "I know God in Latin," he said, "and everything else I know in Walloon, and after that I am entirely at the mercy of other people." "Which is probably as it should be," he smiled. A real smile, unpracticed, without social function. "Although it does mean that every time I travel I am trusting a great deal to the accuracy of whoever translates for me." "Most translators are accurate," she said. "And the ones who aren't?" "Usually accurate in directions that suit them," she said. He laughed at this, a genuine laugh, the kind that didn't need a social occasion to justify it, and said something warm and brief about the value of honest craftspeople. And then someone had called him away about something, and they had not spoken again until the dinner began. But she had liked him. Immediately, without qualification, which was rare for her. She liked him because he thought about language as a real thing, with real properties, rather than as a neutral delivery system. She liked him because he had asked the follow-up question. She liked him because he had laughed at the thing that was actually funny, rather than the thing that was expected to be funny. And she filed him, in the part of her mind where she filed the people worth paying attention to, under Bishop, Liège, Honest Eyes, asks the second question. The wine glass had been in her hand since the fish course began. She was not drinking from it. She was holding it, rotating it slowly by the stem, the way some people hold a worry stone in their pocket or count a rosary in their fingers. It was not something she had started consciously. It had simply begun to happen, around her late 20s, in the rooms where the work was most demanding, and by now it was as automatic as breathing. The pen was in her dominant hand, the wine glass was in her other hand, the card was in her lap. These were the three anchors she kept in difficult rooms. And tonight, not because of anything that had happened yet, simply because of the structure of the room, the presence of the Duke, the accumulated weight of being in a room like this one where the weight was always distributed the same way, she needed all three. She was not anxious, not exactly. She did not experience most rooms as threatening. She experienced them as demanding, in the particular way that being always slightly outside the center of things is demanding, not threatening, not hostile, just continuous. You are present in the room, but you are never quite in the room in the way the people at the center of it are in the room. You are listening in a way they are not listening, tracking things they are not tracking, working while they are being entertained. And that work, the continuous work of being precisely present while appearing only casually present, accumulated over the course of an evening the way physical work accumulates. You didn't feel it while you were doing it. You felt it afterward, when you sat down with your coat off and realized that sitting down felt like something. The wine glass turned. The fish course came and went. 3 sauces as she had predicted. She ate all 3, methodically, while making the appropriate sounds of appreciation at the appropriate moments. She caught Madame Den Haag's eye once across the table and gave the slight tilt of her head that meant, "Nothing requiring your attention yet, I'll tell you afterward." Madame Den Haag gave back a minuscule nod. 40 years of diplomatic marriage had compressed her into a woman who could read an eyebrow from across a table and respond to it with the flicker of a finger while appearing to do nothing at all. The wine glass turned. The Duke moved through the fish course with his anecdotes and his languages, sorting the room into French and German, and Mira tracked him with one part of her attention, while the rest of her attention moved across the rest of the table, collecting the room the way you collect a room, which is not all at once but in small continuous takes, like breathing, each breath a slightly different angle on the whole. By the time the cheese arrived, she had a complete picture. The cheese was excellent. She had noticed this about formal Brussels events in 1887. The cheese was always taken seriously, more seriously than in some other European cities she had worked in. A Gouda, aged just past the point of yielding, approaching something more complex and dense. A soft, runny brie that needed to be eaten quickly and decisively before it made its own decision about the matter. A hard wedge of something blue and powerful from a region she didn't immediately identify, the kind of cheese that required commitment. She helped herself to the Gouda first. She always did. The Duke began an anecdote about a hunting trip in Bavaria. She tracked it with one part of her attention and used the rest to look at the bishop, who was making slow but happy progress on the blue cheese, and had the expression of a man pleasantly surprised by his own decisiveness. 4 minutes into the anecdote, she tracked time automatically, a background process like posture. The Duke was describing local guides. The guides were, in his account, always the same type, useful within their limits, picturesque, but limited. Limited, he said, settling into the French word for it, giving it room. A particular kind of intelligence. The kind that can replicate, that can follow a path already walked, but cannot originate, cannot conceive the path itself. You take my meaning. Several people nodded. Not all of them were following fully. Most understood the shape. He reached for his wine. And then, still mid-sentence, still mid-gesture, with the casualness of someone who has named every object in a room before and is simply moving to the next one, he gestured in Mira's direction, not at her directly, in the general area of where she was, as if indicating a chair. Ces gens de petite noblesse qui jouent aux savants, he said. These people of low breeding who play at being scholars. Charmant comme décoration, naturellement. Charming as decoration, naturally. He laughed a small, comfortable laugh. He lifted his wine and drank. The table moved, not visibly, not audibly, but she felt it, the collective fractional flinch of 12 people who had just witnessed something and were rapidly and privately deciding whether to have witnessed it. The woman across from her became very focused on the brie. The young German attaché picked up his napkin, set it down. Madame Den Haag did not move at all, the total stillness of a woman who has decided not to react yet because reaction requires information she is still collecting. Mira's pen stopped clicking. She looked at the Duke. He had already moved on. The anecdote had absorbed the remark and kept moving. The way a river absorbs a stone. The surface closes over. The stone is on the bottom. The river does not pause. The Gouda was very good. She set her wine glass down. Precisely. The right word for it was precisely. Not with force. Not with signal. The glass simply was in her hand, and then it was on the table, and those two states existed without drama or deliberateness connecting them. If you were watching from a distance, you would not have registered that anything had changed. She sat with what had just happened for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds was usually enough. She had discovered this experimentally, in her late 20s, when she had learned that the gap between receiving something and responding to it was the most important part of the whole exchange. Not the receiving, not the responding, the gap. The 3 seconds in which you let the thing arrive, let the first wave of it hit and pass, and then assess what you had and what it required. In her early 20s, she had not known how to manage the gap. She had sometimes responded too fast, from the first wave, and the response had been shaped by the wave rather than by what she actually wanted to say. Over time, she had learned to wait. 3 seconds. Long enough for the wave, short enough that nothing else filled the silence first. 1. The Duke was describing the terrain of the Bavarian highlands. He used a German word for a specific kind of mountain trail. Nobody around him asked what it meant. 2. Madame Den Haag had put down her fork, It rested against the edge of her plate at an angle that was not the angle of a fork that had been set down. It was the angle of a fork that had been placed. A decision, not an accident. 3. Mira turned, not toward the Duke, not toward Madame Den Haag, whose stillness was the most articulate thing in the room. She turned toward the far end of the table, toward the bishop, who was just then reaching the successful conclusion of his engagement with the blue cheese, and looked quite pleased about it. She spoke in Dutch, conversational volume, the same register she used when she passed messages across conference tables, when she read aloud from documents in small government offices, with the afternoon light coming through inadequate windows, when she translated telegrams in the waiting rooms of people who needed to know things urgently and had hired her specifically to deliver the knowing. The professional voice. Clear and even and slightly unhurried. The voice of someone transmitting information from one language to another without editing it, because that was the job, because accuracy was the job, because fidelity to the original was the job. Your Excellency, she said. The Duke has just shared an observation about people of modest background who acquire education. He finds them charming in the way that table decorations are charming, pleasant to look at, limited in other respects. I thought you would want to understand the jest, since it appears to be the principal entertainment of the evening. She did not look at the Duke while she said this. She did not look at him when she finished. She picked up the wineglass she had set down, and she drank from it. For the first time all evening. The table went the kind of quiet that has texture and specific weight, the kind you can feel in your chest before you have named it. Not the quiet of comfort, not the quiet of nothing occurring, the quality of silence that arrives when 12 people have simultaneously understood that something has just happened and they are all, independently, deciding what kind of thing it was and what it requires of them. The air in the room had changed the way it changes when someone opens a window in winter. Not dramatically cold, not violent, but unmistakably different from the air of one moment before. The Duke's anecdote stopped, not because he had chosen to stop it, because the air had shifted, and even a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where the air changed for other people and never for him could feel this particular shift. His mouth was still slightly open. The next word of the story was in his throat, and it could not find the way out, because the shape of the room had changed, and he did not yet know what the new shape was, or how to move inside it. Bishop Aubert had set down his fork. He looked at Mira, then at the Duke, then back at Mira, a fraction of a second, a quarter turn of his head, with an expression she would spend time afterward trying to find the right word for and eventually settle on: recognition. Not just of what she had said, but of what she had done, and why, and what it had cost to do it in that particular way rather than some other way, and what the difference between the ways meant. Then the bishop turned to the Duke. He spoke in French, slow French, the French of a man who is building something and needs each stone to be placed correctly. "Ah," he said, "how generous of you to share." 4 words. They arrived the way a door closes firmly without slamming, the sound of a decision rather than an emotion, and therefore harder to dismiss. They landed on the Duke's chest and sat there without sliding off. The Duke had no immediate response to them. Men who are accustomed to being the ones who land things do not always know, in the moment, what to do with things that land on them. There was a pause. It lasted exactly as long as a pause can last before it becomes the conversation. Then someone at the far end of the table said something about the railway schedule, and someone else responded, and the cheese continued moving, and the Duke lifted his wine, and when he set it back down, the hunting anecdote did not resume. It had simply ended, the way some sentences end when you run out of things that need to be said, and no one at that table was going to wind it back up. Mira was writing on her small card. She was noting the etymology she had wanted to look up, a compound the Dutch ambassador had used during the soup course that she had been meaning to note since before the fish. She wrote it in her shorthand. Her hand was steady. She had expected something in her chest, some residue, some echo, and instead there was just the pen moving, and the card, and the specific, small task of getting the word down accurately. Madame Den Haag reached across and refilled Mira's wineglass. Not the servant, Madame Den Haag herself, with her own hand, without ceremony. Neither of them said anything. But when Mira looked up from her card, she and Madame Den Haag looked at each other for one long, level second, and in that second there passed between them the kind of understanding that only travels between two women who have both, at different points in their lives, been furniture in important rooms, and have found different ways of surviving the condition, and have recognized in each other the surviving. The cheese moved on. The evening moved forward. Not smoothly, exactly, but forward, which is most of what you can ask of an evening. The Duke recovered. He was, first and last, a practiced man. By the time the dessert arrived, he had reinserted himself into the conversation at the German end of the table, and his voice was the same voice, and his laugh was the same laugh, and if you had walked into the room at that moment, having missed everything before it, you would have seen nothing wrong. He did not tell another anecdote for the rest of the evening, and he did not gesture in Mira's direction again, not once. She noticed, because her job was to notice precisely this kind of thing, the shape of what was deliberately not happening, with neither satisfaction nor dissatisfaction. She noticed the way you note that the weather has changed, as information, received, filed. She did not write anything on her card about him. Some things did not need to be preserved. After dinner, while coffee was served in the drawing room, Bishop Aubert made his way to where Mira stood near the window. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands, the way people hold things when they have made a decision and are comfortable with it. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Excellency," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the street for a moment. The gas lamps made soft circles on the wet cobblestones. A carriage passed, and the sound of hooves came through the glass, clean and specific in the cold. "I have been a bishop for 19 years, he said. "Before that, a priest for 15. In that time, I have been in many rooms, and I have heard many things said in the assumption that I could not follow, or didn't understand, or would choose not to remember." He paused. He drank from his cup. "It is a very particular experience, to watch someone else do what I have always wished I knew how to do in those moments." Mira considered this. "I only translated," she said. "Yes," he said. "Exactly." He raised his cup very slightly. Not quite a toast, not quite a salute, something between those two that she didn't have a word for but understood completely. Then he moved away towards someone across the room, and the conversation folded itself into the evening the way good things fold into evenings, without remainder. She stood at the window. She held her coffee cup. She looked at the street. She did not rotate the cup. She thought about the legal firm she had worked for in her middle 20s, whose senior partners spoke French to her, and Dutch among themselves, apparently under the impression that competence traveled in one direction only. She thought about the reception in 1879, where a government minister had asked her to fetch more coffee, having mistaken her for a serving girl, and she had brought it because the alternative was a scene she couldn't afford. She thought about the 111 dinners, give or take, in 11 years, in the chair close enough to be useful and far enough not to matter. She thought about all of that for about 30 seconds. Then she finished her coffee. The carriage home took 30 minutes. Madame Den Haag rode with her for the first part, as she usually did after formal events, and they sat in the warm dark of the carriage interior without speaking for a while, which was a comfortable silence, the kind that had nothing it needed to prove. "You know," Madame Den Haag said eventually, "in 30 years of diplomatic work, I have known 3 professional interpreters." Mira said. "The first 2 would have sat very still. They would have let it go past. They would have found a way to feel dignified about it afterward, which is the correct response. It is the dignified choice, and I have made it myself more than once." "It is," Mira said. The third one confronted the man directly, at the table, and made an incident significant enough that the host family declined to use an interpreter for the following 3 years. Mira looked at the dark city passing outside the glass. "And what would you call what I did?" she asked. Madame Den Haag was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of thinking, the quiet of someone who already knows the answer and is deciding how much of the knowing to offer. "I would call it a translation," she said, "a completely accurate one." The carriage turned, and the lantern swayed, and for a moment they were both briefly in shadow, and then the lantern settled, and they were in the light again. He will not speak of it, Madame Den Haag said. Men like that are very skilled at deciding what was and wasn't significant. He will decide, probably within the next hour, that nothing of consequence occurred. I know, Mira said. Does that bother you? The question was genuine. Madame Den Haag only asked genuine questions. Mira thought about the cheese, the Gouda specifically, the particular quality of something that had been aged carefully past the point of yielding until it arrived at something denser and more fully itself. She thought about the bishop's 4 words and the way they had landed. She thought about the wine glass she had held all evening and finally drunk from after she spoke. The cheese was excellent, she said. Madame Den Haag looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh, unplanned, warm in the carriage between them. Yes, she said. It was. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence and said good night at Mira's street, with the small efficiency of 2 people who understood each other and did not need to elaborate on it. The apartment on Rue du Trône was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen. The walls were bookshelves, and the bookshelves were dictionaries. French-Dutch, Dutch-German, German-French, German-Latin, a French-English she had owned since she was 19 and repaired the spine of herself 3 times with small careful stitches because good dictionaries were expensive and she intended to keep using this one. Between the dictionaries were other books, history mostly, natural science in patches, and 1 shelf of novels that she did not discuss with employers but had no shame about having. She lit the lamp. She took off her coat. She put the kettle on. She sat at the writing desk. Plain wood, 12 francs from a man clearing out an office in 1880, the most useful piece of furniture she had ever owned, and she opened her diary. She wrote the date, October 14th, 1887. She wrote, Dinner at Van Houten Residence, 14 guests. Fish in 3 sauces, as predicted. Cheese excellent. She wrote, Bishop A. from Liège. Broad face, clear eyes, knows he doesn't know things, and finds this amusing rather than threatening, which is the mark of someone who has learned something actual from being alive. She paused. She wrote, Duke HK of Saxony. Good surfaces. Speaks French to sort the room. Not a stupid man. That is the interesting thing. Stupid men do not notice when they have been answered. He noticed. He was genuinely surprised, which tells you a great deal about how long he has gone without being surprised. She stopped again. The kettle had begun to murmur. She got up and made her tea, brought it back, sat down at the desk. The lamp made a circle of warm light on the page. Outside the window the street was quiet. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote, The cheese was excellent. She closed the diary. She found the etymology she had been looking for, the compound from the Dutch ambassador, in the 3rd dictionary she tried. She made a note on a separate piece of paper and added it to the wooden box under the desk, the private box, the one that held 11 years of language observations and social notations that had nowhere to go in official documents. The accumulated marginalia of a professional life lived at the edges of rooms where important things happened. She had been meaning to sort the box for 3 years and had not. It was more useful unsorted. She washed her cup. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. She had known, since around age 14, that she was going to spend her professional life in rooms where she did not fully belong. This was not a conclusion she had arrived at with regret. It was simply a fact about the shape of things, the way certain facts about the shapes of lives simply are, without cruelty, without apology, as structural as the walls. She had grown up in the part of Brussels that was not the good part. Her father taught basic arithmetic at a parish school. Her mother had grown up speaking Flemish and learned French as an adult, and always spoke it with a careful quality that was not quite an accent, and not quite an apology, but was somewhere between the two, a quality that Mira had spent her childhood watching and spent her adulthood quietly and deliberately not replicating. Languages came to her the way numbers come to some people, not as labor but as pattern. French arrived when she was 6, from the street and the school and the books. German when she was 12, from a neighbor from Cologne who paid her in occasional pastries to help him write letters and who taught her, without meaning to, That precision in language was a form of respect for the person you were writing to. Dutch she had always half known from her mother, and when she formalized it at 16, it felt less like learning and more like being properly introduced to someone you had known by description for years. Latin she taught herself from the dictionary at 15, because it was there, and because understanding Latin meant that French and Italian and Portuguese stopped being separate things and started being the same thing, wearing different clothes. By 20, she was working as a secretary in a government office. By 22, she was doing interpretation work for the office formally. By 25, she was doing it independently, which paid better and, more important, gave her more control over which rooms she agreed to enter. Not all rooms were worth entering. She had developed a system for assessing this. Not a written system, a felt one. She had tried, at 26, to obtain a position at the Belgian Foreign Ministry. She had the languages and the experience and 3 years of professional work and references from 2 government households. She did not have the right name or the right father or the right kind of certainty about whether she was allowed to want the thing she was trying to get. She came close. A senior official told her she had been an impressive candidate. She went back to the private work. She had decided at some point in her early 30s, good at it. Not just competent, actually good, in the way that is visible from inside the work before it is visible from outside. And she was doing, in the chair close enough to be useful and far enough not to matter, something that nobody in the other chairs was doing. She was listening to the whole room simultaneously. She was keeping the record. She was building, over years and rooms and dinners and conferences, the most complete and accurate picture of how the world she moved through actually worked. The real mechanics of it, the thing beneath the performance, that anyone in any of those rooms was building. Most people in those rooms were performing. That was fine. Performance had a function. But beneath the performance was the actual thing, and the actual thing was what she was watching, from the edge, which was where the actual seeing happened. She had 41 working diaries by the time she retired in 1914. She had written in the last one, a few weeks before she stopped, "The most useful thing I have ever done in this work was learn how to be in a room without the room knowing I was there. This took many years to learn, and I cannot tell you exactly when it became something I did automatically rather than something I was working at. I think it simply arrived, one evening while I was holding a wine glass. Bishop Aubert died in 1901. She read the notice in the paper and thought about the drawing room at the Van Houten house, the careful French, the 4 words, the broad, honest face, the way he had said exactly as if it were the most natural completion to what she had said, which it was. She had received, 3 days after the dinner, a short note from him sent through Madame Den Haag's household. The note was formally correct, in careful French, thanking her for the quality of work he had witnessed at the dinner. At the end, in slightly different handwriting, as if he had returned to the letter at a later point and added it, he had written one line, the most precise translation I have ever had the privilege of hearing. She filed it in the wooden box under the desk. 3 years after that, his sister in Namur received a letter from him describing the dinner. He had written about the translator without knowing her full name. She was, in his letter, a woman of about 30 who works for the diplomatic households, very composed, very precise, speaks with the economy of someone who has learned that words are not decoration. He wrote, "I watched a man try to use language as a weapon against someone he had decided was below him, and I watched her pick up the same weapon and point it back at the room, and I said 4 words, and they were her words, really. I was only delivering them." His sister wrote back, "She sounds remarkable. Do you know her name?" He wrote back, "Something beginning with V, I think. I should have asked properly." Her diaries were found in 1961 by a history student in a Brussels archive. It took 3 years of patient searching and one excellent archivist who had been waiting her entire career for someone to ask the right question. The student read them over the course of a winter. She later wrote that reading them was like standing at the edge of a room for 40 years, alongside someone who described everything happening at the center with complete precision and absolute calm. Someone who had been in every room but never of it, and had used that position to see more clearly than anyone who stood at the center ever could. The bishop's letter to his sister, describing the dinner in October 1887, had ended up in an uncatalogued box in Namur. The history student found it 2 years into her research. She put the letter and the diaries together on a table in a small archive room and sat very still for a long time. Then she translated them. That is what the story requires, finally. Not the performance of significance. Not the announcement of itself. It sits at the edge of the room, the way Mira sat, the way the wooden box sat under the desk for decades, the way the wineglass sat in her hand without anyone counting the evenings she had held it, and it waits for someone patient enough to look at the edge, where the actual seeing happens, where it has always happened. The cheese, she wrote, was excellent.